This is Molly Reardon. I was going through my things and I found an old newspaper article by Pat Brown about my grandmother. And I'll read it to you. It's called A Recipe to Kill For. A few weeks ago, Jan Johnson and I went to visit Marion McGuire one Sunday after church. It was very nice to sit and chat with her and to see her feeling better. She invited us to have some tea and snacks. On the table, there were brownies, cookies, and some delicious-looking square things with white toppings. I sampled one of those square desserts first and immediately lost all interest in the brownies and cookies. You know what they say about potato chips? You can't eat just one. Well, that goes for those strange square things. Keeping in mind my lack of gourmet cooking abilities, you shouldn't be surprised to learn that I didn't even know what they were. So as I reached for square number 2, I asked Marion what they were. "Date and nut squares," she replied. "Would you like the recipe?" As I reached for square number 3, I chuckled and said, "No, thank you. I wouldn't know what to do with it. I may not be a gourmet cook, but I know a good thing when I eat it." As an experienced food critic, I give the date and nut squares my personal seal of approval with a 4-star rating. Then Marion told me and Jan that she had made these delicious desserts for the women's group before, and some of the women had asked for the recipe. She had planned to put it in the Women's Get-Together Association cookbook, but because of circumstances beyond her control, was never able to get it done. Even at the Women's Association Christmas party, some of the women remembered and asked Marion for the recipe. And by the way, Marion says, it's better to crush the walnuts yourself rather than buying crushed walnuts, which are often too small. So if you stay to the end of this video, you will get a recipe to kill for. I'll tell you how to get it. But first, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the woman behind the recipe. She came from a place in Canada called Prince Edward Island. And her people came to Prince Edward Island from Scotland, from the Isle of Skye. In myth and legend, there was a castle there called Dunvegan Castle, and to this day, the fairy flag still hangs in Dunvegan Castle. When the castle burned, the only part that survived was the part where the fairy flag was. So that's a tongue twister. So you'll see the fairy bridge and the fairy pools if you go there. But the legend and the myth is that the man of the castle fell in love with a fairy, and they had a child. But one day, the king of the fairies came, and he said the deal was a year and a day. He told her, "You have to come home with me." So the young man watched sadly as his woman crossed the bridge with her fairy father, the king, and she left behind the baby with him. So there was a great party later at the castle, and a young girl was assigned to watch the baby, and she was told not to leave the baby alone, but she did. And our ancestor found the baby crying, and the girl had been tempted to go look at the party. And he knew that the fairy mother had come because her yellow shawl was wrapped around the little baby. in myth and legend says that that flag, they turned it into a flag, was raised 2 times and won a battle, and it still can be raised for one more battle. And people come from all over the world to study that flag to see if they can figure out what it's made of. So that's where my grandmother's people came from, in Scotland. The Isle of Skye. You can see it here. But she was scheduled to marry a rich Englishman, and she fell in love with my Irish grandfather. In those days, you just didn't do that. So she was kind of a rebel. She was also top of geometry in her class, and she taught school. So she came to America, and she married my grandfather, and she came down to Massachusetts, and they lived in a house that overlooked the Boston Harbor, and you could see the sea outside of her window, and Boston. And she loved to bake. She had a tiny little kitchen, but she would whip up huge feasts for anyone that came by on a dime. And she would serve tea. She had a tablecloth, cloth napkins, china, and silver that was ancient, that I have packed away at my sister's house because I've been traveling. So she also had walls that lined with bookshelves that my grandfather built. And sometimes she would encourage my reading when I found $1 or $2 in the book and say I could keep it if I found any. So I love reading. So they lived together for many years. She passed away in her 90s, and my grandfather passed away before her. He died in her arms at home, and they very much loved each other and their children. A funny story about her, I said to her, "Do you ever get bored with cooking?" And she said, "No." I said, "How come you're such a wonderful cook?" And she said, "Your grandfather can't keep his hands off me in the kitchen." Which was funny coming from her because she was very proper. So that's a little bit about the woman behind the recipe. There's more. So if you would like that recipe, you can send me a message. I'll put my email in the description, and I will email it to you as soon as I can. The last thing I'll tell you is her daughter, my mother's sister, my aunt, had a friend who was very smart. She got into the kitchen with my grandmother, and she watched her, and she has since opened a bakery, I'm told, on Martha's Vineyard. I've never been there, but she came to my aunt's funeral, and I guess on the menu is Marion's, one of her recipes, one of her dessert recipes, Marion squares. So I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to my channel. Much love, and thank you for tuning in.